Hello. June marks World Infertility Month, a time to bring awareness to the many couples in Hong Kong and around the world that are struggling to conceive. A time to break down the silence, remove the stigmas, and offer support to couples wanting to build the family of their dreams. Infertility affects 1 in 6 couples globally. It affects men and women equally. In couples experiencing infertility, approximately 35% is due to male factors, 35% is due to female factors, and 20% is due to male and female factors, and the last 10% are unexplained causes. Doctors cannot determine why a couple is struggling to conceive. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Benita Perch, IMI's Managing Director, Naturopathic Physician and Homeopath. Benita specializes in supporting women and men who are experiencing infertility and want real answers and solutions so they can successfully go on to become pregnant and complete their family. Benita, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I know infertility is a health challenge that you're passionate about helping families through. What is it that you're seeing perhaps in Hong Kong or globally that's compelling you as a naturopath to help couples?
So what I've noticed in my practice more and more, especially, I've been practicing for almost 14 years. And what I started to notice is, couples are just struggling to get pregnant more than they were before. And the things that I think are impacting that is the stress levels. Hong Kong work hours and stress is much higher than a lot of other places, but stress is an impact globally, as well as toxicity. The world is becoming a much more toxic place on all levels. And then Hong Kong is a notch up on that compared to globally as well. And all of those factors are having, an impact on getting pregnant. Also generally people are sort of waiting later as well, which has an impact, but also I'm seeing a lot of infertility struggles in people in their late 20s, early 30s as well. So, it's not just because you're not older and waited. It's, everyone is struggling more than they were like 10 or 20 years ago. I'm a mom of 2, I'm super passionate. Like, I just feel like I think it's part of the reason I'm here on the planet is to really help anybody who wants to have a child to be able to conceive. And what I started to notice is I was starting to see people, who've been trying for 5 or 6 years, who have gone through lots of IVF treatments, or who have seen lots of doctors, but some of the basics hadn't been addressed. And so I started to realize, wow, okay. And even they'd seen other people in my own profession, and I still felt like important things really hadn't been looked at. And it's sort of become a niche of mine over the years that I think also because I have a very different way of addressing infertility than a lot of other people. And I started to get really good success as well, like really difficult cases, women were getting pregnant. Or on the flip side, which has happened to me a lot, is I started to treat women, let's say, for fatigue or gut issues. And they're sort of at the age where they're trying, and boom, the next month they're like, oh, I'm pregnant unexpectedly. So it's almost like the minute we started to get the body into balance, right, the body was like, okay, I'm ready to get pregnant. So it's just as the years have evolved and the more women I've helped, I've become more and more passionate about this, because I'm like, okay, there's huge amount of difference that we can do. And there's so many avenues that can be looked at to help women, as opposed to just doing, millions and millions of hormones and cycles over and over. And not to say that that's not important, but that's one part of the path. But you can't do that without looking at all the other factors as well.
That's so encouraging, particularly for couples who have no idea why they can't conceive, and doctors kind of throwing their hands up in the air. They've tried everything that they can, and they're saying, we don't know why you can't conceive. I mean, that must be so tough for a man and a woman. You mentioned the basics are being missed. What are these basics, Benita?
So I guess, I'll explain that in the terms of the core of how I practice, right? So I'm trained as a naturopathic physician in the US. So first and foremost, I think like a doctor.
Right.
Secondly, I think as a naturopathic physician, where I use functional medicine tests, I'm looking at cause, I'm looking to balance the body. And then also I'm trained in classical homeopathy. So I always use homeopathy as well in my practice. So I guess, you know, if you think in terms of like that, we start with the basics where I'm thinking like a doctor. What's been missed? So one of the big things that I just see get missed and not even tested, which is so surprising to me, is thyroid. I have picked up so many women trying to get pregnant who actually have the beginning of hypothyroidism and an autoimmune condition called Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which hugely can interfere with getting pregnant. And in our world, usually I want a TSH at least less than 2. And if you look at some of the fertility doctors sort of in the US, they're wanting a TSH even less than that in the women that are trying to get pregnant. So that's one big basic area that I see often get missed.
Right.
The other thing is just looking at nutrient levels, right? So you think of it, you're asking your body to get pregnant. It needs its tools. It needs to know, I've got enough iron, I've got enough vitamin D, I've got enough magnesium, I've got enough zinc, I've got enough Bs to get pregnant, right? And, you know, unfortunately, not to name names, but the very common, you know, prenatal that used in Hong Kong is appalling. Like, it's a 1 a day. You look at the ingredient list, it's the wrong forms of the vitamins, it's not good quality, and it really should be just thrown in the bin. And, you know, basics, and I'm not, okay, so maybe sort of zinc, magnesium, you know, looking at sort of folate, B12, a little bit out of more in the naturopathic realm, though it shouldn't be, but looking at vitamin D, looking at if women are anemic, looking at ferritin levels to see iron storage, that should be sort of common practice, right? And it's not. So those are sort of the basics that I'm just looking at. The other basic, which I actually think of as a basic, even though it sort of bridges the doctor naturopathic world, is looking at methylation and looking at even, you know, I do quite an extensive epigenetic test, which we'll talk about more about later. But the basics that should be tested is just to see if women have issues with the MTHFR gene, which means are they able to utilize folate and convert it to the active form. And that should be being tested by all regular doctors. If I look at all the fertility doctors, I treat a lot of patients who are doing fertility fertility treatments in the US, Australia, Taiwan, Spain, Thailand. Those doctors are all looking at MTHFR as a basic, and then some more genetic factors. And
happening in Hong Kong at the moment.
And it's not happening at all in Hong Kong. It is not. I don't think I've seen a single fertility doctor order an MTHFR test in Hong Kong. Maybe that's unfair. Maybe there's been once or twice, but it's not common practice. Right. And also, no woman should be taking a prenatal that has folic acid in, because 40% of women have issues with the MTHFR gene. And those who are trying to get pregnant, I would say almost 90%, 95% have issues with the MTHFR gene. So they're not able to even utilize folic acid and convert it to the active form. Okay. And the reason this is so important is that the end product of the methylation cycle, which, you know, requires folate in its active form and B12 in its active form, is to make something called SAMe. SAMe donates a methyl group, or a CH3 group, if you go into the world of biochemistry, to 200 enzymes in the body. One of the most important things it does is to make and fix DNA. And what is the first thing that the embryo does once it's implanted? It demethylates and it remethylates. If you don't have enough of the active form like methylfolate and methyl B12 to be able to create SAMe, you can't remethylate, and boom, you have an early miscarriage. Because when you remethylated that embryo, there were errors, and the body was like, okay, this is not going to work. And take a step back, even in trying to get pregnant to begin with and make good egg quality and the sperm to be good quality, you need to be methylating well. So it's a core thing. So no woman should be taking a prenatal with folic acid anymore. Like, if nothing else, make sure that the prenatal you're taking has methylfolate and methyl B12. That's like a basic. So that's just the basic, right? Those are the basic things before you've even kind of started to go digging into causes that we should be looking at, is making sure the thyroid is okay, making sure there are no nutrient deficiencies, and making sure there are no methylation issues.
And the nutrient deficiencies, is that quite common in Hong Kong?
Very, very common. So I mean, I don't have exact statistics, they're out there, but, you know, the vitamin D deficiency is almost endemic in Hong Kong. Right. I think, you know, in my years of practice, I think I can count on my hand 10 people that have had normal vitamin D. And those have been, most of those have been since I've been in Phuket, where people actually spend large amounts of time in the sun. So they actually do have normal vitamin D levels. My vitamin D level was recently high, and I haven't been taking D, and it was just because I'm actually spending so much time in the sun. Right. So, you know, the levels that we're looking at where they talk about being sufficient at 30, like that's just the tip of the iceberg. We should be at least between 45 and 65 for healthy D levels. Iron is super common, especially among certain populations. And obviously with, you know, veganism and vegetarian becoming more and more popular, which is great from a health perspective, but then you need to make sure you're getting the nutrients that might be being missed. You know, magnesium deficiency, zinc deficiency, super common. So yeah, these are not like out there, you know, like these, even B12, these are very, very common deficiencies.
Right. And they need to be addressed in order to be able to carry successfully. Okay. And so those are some of the basics. I imagine that there are more. What about from the integrative and naturopathic viewpoint? You mentioned that you first look at it from the perspective of a doctor and then as a naturopath. So from the integrative and naturopathic viewpoint, what causes or contributing factors of infertility would you be looking at?
So they're basically 6 big factors that I kind of look at. And this is sort of, again, a general approach that I take in treating from a naturopathic perspective and looking for inflammation and things that are wrong in the body. So one of them is, are there any epigenetic issues going on? So epigenetics are where you can look at certain genes to see how you're born. And these are genes that are not like sort of Down syndrome, which is nothing you can do about. These are epigenetic genes that by making certain lifestyle changes and taking certain supplements and eating certain foods, you can kind of help compensate or even influence how the gene is. Or if you take more of the cofactor, let's say even with MTHFR, if you take more B2, you help that MTHFR gene work better. And if you take methylfolate, you're kind of giving the end product of a gene that's not working well. So I do, for all my patients trying to get pregnant, I do epigenetic testing. I use a test called Grow Baby by a company called DNA Analysis. I find it incredibly useful. It does, you know, all the methylation panels, not just MTHFR, but there are all these other genes that we care about. It looks at toxicity. It looks at if you have issues with progesterone. And then it even looks at, you know, what's your risk of having gestational diabetes and issues like that once you're pregnant. So a really, really useful test that can really help make decisions that we need to be doing both in supplementation, lifestyle, and dietary changes when you're trying to get pregnant. So that's one aspect. The other big one that I look at, obviously, depending on the history of my patient and what's going on, is gut. The research that's coming out on the microbiome influence on getting pregnant, I mean, it's exploding, because we're not just talking about the gut microbiome. The uterus has its own microbiome. The ovaries have their own microbiome. And all of these factors make a difference. Like how that uterine line microbiome is how well you might implant or not implant. So looking at the gut, seeing what's kind of growing there, you know, what we use the term dysbiosis in integrative medicine, which means that the balance in the gut is not good. You don't have enough good bacteria, and there might be overgrown things like yeast or some nasty bad bacteria or certain parasites that are growing. And these things, when they grow, they cause, depending, you know, so the bacteria will produce something called endotoxins and LPS. And when that's absorbed in the body, it causes inflammation and causes problems, right? So that's one of the big core issues we've got to look at is the gut. We also have to consider something else. So you can have issues in your large intestine, but you can also have issues in your small intestine, which is small intestinal bile overgrowth. And the other thing that's very common in Hong Kong is a lot of people have H. pylori overgrowth in the stomach. So you've got all those layers in the gut that could be interfering and causing inflammation and affecting, you know, sort of interfering with you getting pregnant. So, you know, any patients who find they've got chronic like issues with stool not going every day, or loose stool or mushy stool, or chronic gas and bloating, they've got to be thinking, okay, I have gut issues.
They've got an impact.
That they're having an impact, right? The other big area then is food, right? And so there are two aspects of food, actually, in the sense of, one is just cleaning up your diet generally, like taking out the big six. And sort of, for me, the big six when you've got inflammation or anything is gluten, dairy, sugar, white in the terms of white bread, white rice, white pasta, alcohol, and fried. We eat a lot of food with, the wrong oils and deep fried. I'm not talking about a healthy stir fry with olive oil or avocado oil. I'm talking about, you're going out to a restaurant in Hong Kong and you're eating something sort of that's been heavily deep fried in probably a not so good vegetable oil. So those are the big six: gluten, dairy, sugar, white, alcohol, and fried. And a lot of people are like, oh, gluten, like, oh, is really everyone gluten sensitive? And in my general population, I don't generally say everyone needs to be off gluten. But the big really issue is not so much that we've become all gluten sensitive. It's the fact that wheat, the way your sort of standardized wheat product has been made in agriculture, we've messed up wheat over the years, and it's become inflammatory for almost most people. So almost everyone I know who cuts out wheat is like, oh, my gut feels better, right? Like universally. And it's not because everyone's sensitive to gluten. So if they sat down with probably a really good quality sourdough and they're not gluten sensitive and it's from a really good starter, they would be fine. But we're talking about, that's not what people are eating mostly on a day-to-day basis, right? So there's the healthy diet perspective, but then there's also, for certain people, especially if they have gut issues or a lot of inflammation in the body, like joint pain, fatigue, brain fog, is that there are certain foods that certain people just don't do well with that cause what we call intolerance or inflammation. And this is also different to the standard kind of medical testing where they do allergies. I'm not talking about allergies here. Food allergies, which is what we call IgE, most people know about by the time they're an adult. Like, oh, if I eat kiwi, I react. If I'm allergic to almonds, I'm going to have a bad reaction. We're talking about foods that are causing chronic inflammation in the body. And you eat something and maybe 24 to 48 hours later, you're just feeling kind of crappy. And the body doesn't process it well, and you feel achy and you get headaches and you're tired. And we can do testing for that. It's called IgG, or food intolerance testing. Controversial, but in my experience, clinically, it's been invaluable in treating so many cases. And it's incredibly important in infertility cases because we need to be addressing inflammation. We need to be looking at the reasons why people aren't getting pregnant. So we've got, epigenetics, we've got gut, we've got food, both from healthy diet, generally anti-inflammatory diet, but also specific food. We've got stress. Stress, I don't even know, and stress since COVID, right? Like next level of stress that I've ever seen in practice, right? I can't tell you, the last 2 years has probably been, one of the most stressful times for me as a doctor, because my patients are going through such a hard time, and it's been holding everybody and making sure everyone is okay. And stress was big before. So people are working longer hours. We're on all the time, because email, I can't tell you, even for me, like I get emails at 9 p.m. at night, and I'm like, no, I try not to check my email after 8 p.m. at night. I'm like, okay, I'm done. I'll deal with that in the morning. But people's expectations have changed, and especially in some of the very, financial cities, where a lot of people are struggling to get pregnant. It's this expectation of, oh yeah, I can send you a WhatsApp or an email at 9 or 10 p.m. and you will reply to that, right? So you think of that, your body is never coming out of sympathetic, right? If you think of the nervous system, our autonomic and nervous system, where our sympathetic is our fight or flight and our parasympathetic is our calm and rest and digest. Your body's trying to get pregnant, and it's never in the rest and digest, and it's only in that sympathetic mode. And that's going to be really tough, right? That's why so many women, they go on holiday and they get pregnant, or they've been struggling for years and then they decide to adopt, and then suddenly they fall pregnant because, that stress has gone. So stress can't be underestimated in how much an impact. And in my world, there's so much that we can do. We can help, we can with adrenal herbs and, certain nutrients like magnesium and Bs, and help the body cope better. I'll talk about homeopathy a little bit later, but homeopathy helps to change the perception of the stress, right? Because sometimes we just have to teach ourselves that it's okay to not be perfect. It's okay to not reply to that email and make the person wait till the next day. They'll survive, you'll survive, and that's what's going to be best for you. It is okay to take that afternoon out and be selfish and go sit on the beach and just veg. Like, that's good. That actually means you'll be more productive afterwards because you've given your body, and we've forgotten that as a society. We have forgotten how important rest is, how important joy is. And that, I think, is probably, if I could name, again, I think toxins are big up there as well, but I think that is the core issue of why we're seeing so much unexplained infertility, right? Is the impact that stress is having in our world that we live in nowadays. The other area to which is not always a big one, but it's something to consider, which also causes inflammation, and this is very relevant in the world that we're in right now, is chronic viral inflammation, post-viral syndromes. We were dealing a lot with, Epstein-Barr virus, CMV before. Now we have the whole gamut of COVID interfering, right? Both from the vaccinations and getting COVID. So I feel like that's an area that I'm just starting to wrap my head in. That's going to bring a whole different dynamic into this whole question as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are you seeing, I know that you treat clients around the world. Are you seeing more evidence of stress in Hong Kong or financial cities like Hong Kong compared to, say, Phuket, for example?
Absolutely. And it's not to say that infertility isn't everywhere, right? And people don't have stress everywhere, but the impact seems more in the sort of very intense cities. Definitely. And it's interesting too. I see patients because, what's interesting with, the Hong Kong dynamic now, I have patients who are now all around the world, and a lot of them become quite easier to treat once they're out of Hong Kong because the toxin levels are less. And sometimes, there's just a bit more work balance is more accepted, in certain places and certain countries. And so suddenly their symptoms are just easier to treat when they're out of the intensity, which has been super interesting to see as well.
Right.
Yeah, so interesting. And then I guess the other aspect, as I mentioned earlier, that I personally bring into treating, which is probably slightly different to a lot of functional medicine doctors or naturopathic doctors, is I am also a homeopath. Homeopathy is, very controversial in the world, but a super passion of mine. I always say to my patients, if I had to give up using everything in practice, the only thing that I'd want to be on a desert island would be with a kit of homeopathy.
Wow,
right?
that says a lot. Yeah.
Homeopathy, if you get the right homeopathic remedy, and that's the key with homeopathy, is taking a good case, finding the right remedy. It's almost like finding the right key for the patient's luck is just incredible. The body you just sort of kind of unlock, and the body starts to go into balance. Some of the research on homeopathy is interesting. When they've given homeopathy to cells, in vitro, it almost changes the epigenetic, how the cell expresses itself. So I believe homeopathy is working on quite a very, very deep level. But for me, that's been a game changer in a lot of my cases. Like when I get that right remedy and I get all the other pieces in place, the body responds, and people get pregnant much more easily. So that's just a sort of a side note, but a huge actual part of the way that I practice and help people.
And I know that in a previous conversation, we spoke about the integrated healing model. Is that the puzzle that you're referring to, the kind of different aspects that you're looking at when you're treating a couple with infertility?
Absolutely. So, there are two kind of ways to look at it. So, there's the overall sort of integrative piece, and that's definitely what I look at. And then, as we talked about, the naturopathic puzzle piece, which is kind of the gut, the food, all those pieces coming into it. But yes, from the global perspective, because also, I'm not a silo, right? So I do a full case history. a lot of my patients, are also often seeing, a conventional fertility doctor, and they might be also doing IVF or IUIs, wherever they are in the process. And then I look at everything, right? So, our integrative healing model, we look at emotions, we look at, the mind, we look at community. So often, when I'm seeing, issues in those areas, there's a lot that I can do, but often, especially when there's been trauma in the past, that could be interfering, I'm often referring to a good, psychologist or a good psychoanalyst to really help unpack and help people make peace with things. And when they do that, again, amazing things start to happen, because trauma can be a big obstacle to sort of full cure in sense. Obviously in our healing model, we have environment. I've talked a lot about environment, toxin influence, what you're eating, what you're putting on your body as well. So, right. We're thinking of, makeup, we're thinking of body products, we're thinking of cleaning things. We're also looking at your work environment. So I can't tell you how many patients, also are working in very toxic environments, or in toxic relationships, or toxic relationships with parents that are also having an impact. So these are all the things we're kind of thinking of. We're looking at the body, where we look at it from a term of a naturopathic perspective, but also we want to think in terms of, could there be something structural that's sort of, causing a obstruction somewhere. So I often will refer my patients trying to get pregnant to an osteo, especially an osteo that's trained in visceral osteopathy, where they can assess, is there any blockages in the pelvis? Is there anything misaligned? Is the uterus, there's really interesting stuff from an osteopathy perspective that can see structurally there's something not quite right as well. And then, from the energy over the vitality perspective, I use a lot of homeopathy, and also I tend to refer a lot for acupuncture for women who are trying to get pregnant as well. Acupuncture is very, very effective in helping, because you're increasing circulation. Again, you're balancing the body if you're a proper TCM practitioner. So super, super important. And then, there's the aspect also of, I don't like to use the word, I guess, spirit or purpose, but again, it's kind of, a lot of the times it's really interesting. I have to ask that question, do you really want to have a child, right? Some women, it's because it's family pressure or husband pressure, or, so that's the question too. Or they have one and somebody else wants them to have a second one. So that's a core issue too, right? You need to sit with yourself and go, this is what I want in my life. And being resonant with that will help a lot. And also surrendering, right? There are also reasons sometimes why maybe we're not meant to have a second child, or maybe we're not meant to have a child and we don't really understand that reasoning. There could be something bigger going on that we don't really understand, right? So that's a piece to look at as well. So yes, we really have to, each case, we've got to look at every aspect. We've got to really think about it from an integrative perspective, and make sure that each person is getting the right support that they need, right? So yeah, that's a huge part of sort of holding and figuring out what's going on.
So we talked about, earlier on I mentioned that there are stigmas around infertility and the importance of breaking the silence. I guess a challenge that perhaps isn't talked about as much is infertility in men. Research suggests that 1/3 of men have underlying health issues that are causing infertility. What's your process to determine who needs specific support in a relationship and who might need secondary support?
One of the big things we look at first, which a lot of my patients have already done, sort of a lot of the basic testing by the time they come to me, but not all, because some of them I'm seeing at the beginning of the journey. So we want to look at, with females, egg quality and that type of thing, and if there are any blockages in the ovarian, like the fallopian tubes. And for men, often they're getting their sperm tested, right, to see if there are any issues in, quality and morphology and motility. So females, just the egg quality piece, which we didn't talk about, there are a lot of well-researched nutrients, which again, the medical doctors should be using, like CoQ10, DHEAS, melatonin, vitamin E, inositol, very important. But for men, again, when there are sperm issues, you've got to take that step back, like we're looking at a female case, and go, okay, why? Why do they? So they're definitely nutrients, well-researched nutrients. There are very good products out there that have the arginine and the CoQ10 and all the Bs and the zinc that really help to increase both morphology and motility. But again, with men, you've got to go, okay, but why? Again, is it stress? Is it toxicity? Is it gut health? Is it food? Is it chronic something else that's going on? So, and I feel like the men get kind of, like they get, oh, here's a supplement, take that. And it's all the focus is on the female, which is also not fair sometimes, right? Because sometimes the female body is absolutely fine. All they have to have all the injections and, put through so much. And again, the other piece that really worries me is what's this long-term doing? Because there's no good research on IVF long-term because no one wants to know. But, we need to really be addressing the male factors as well, right? And, I had a case recently where it's like heavy metals and it's his sperm quality because he's high in heavy metals that's interfering with him getting pregnant, right? So you can give everything and get your female patient amazing. And if you're not addressing their counterpart, if they have sort of issues, you're not really going to get anywhere, right? And the male quality, we care just as much as the sperm with methylation and all those aspects, because half of that is the one that's going to be in that embryo, right? So it's half their genes that need to also be right. So yeah, and you're right, it doesn't get talked about. And generally, infertility is such a stigma because people don't want to talk about it, right? To their friends, even sometimes to their family. It's just such a hard process to go through. So much just doesn't get talked about. But there's some great charities. There's a great group in Hong Kong, which has been started by two women. One of them is a patient of mine. They really are there and they're trying to change that in Hong Kong. So women have a space that they can talk to each other and share things with each other. And it would be great if the male, something got started or similar for men going through it, and also men supporting their wives going through it, right? It's a huge stress going through the process. It's a lot of pressure on a relationship as well, also a lot of pressure on maybe another child, an older child that's already there, and their mom is trying to get pregnant, and for 2 weeks of the month their mom is kind of tired and stressed and feeling crappy. So
bad, yeah.
And dad needs to be there. So dad also needs a bit of support as well.
He needs a voice. He needs that support too. And I guess when you share that the body is out of balance and that's what can impact fertility, when you address infertility challenges in a man, you're also putting his body back in balance, which then impacts every other aspect of his well-being and his performance, be it at home, be it with family, be it at work, but it improves his whole well-being.
Energy gets better, immunity gets better. So it's exactly so. Yeah,
which are all things that can be ignored in men, in part because it's not spoken about enough, in part because they don't feel that, many feel that they can't speak up, or that anybody's listening. So that's really valuable that you share that. Thank you. So we spoke about the 7 factors affecting health and well-being, and you mentioned, the other types of support that are available. Is there anything else that you'd like to share, Benita, around infertility?
Sure. I mean, I just want to emphasize again, like how much can be done, right? And as I said, I feel like I get angry about it. Like my patients who know me well, my colleagues, I'm like, when I see someone who's like 5 years down the process and no one has done, looked at basics, I get so cross, right? Because they've lost 5 years and younger years as well. So it's like, don't wait, to get extra support, in the sense of at least get yourself on a good prenatal and some basic testing, even 6 months before you want to get pregnant, right? Just start thinking of everything and getting your body healthy, and just know that there is there's so much that can be done as well. And so many aspects to think about, and so much good research out there as well, right? So as I was saying, even with egg quality, there's been so much research. And again, those are all the things you want to be thinking about even 6 months to a year before you're getting pregnant, so that when you try, boom, like it's interesting. When I treat a lot of women, who I've just been treating, and then they start the process, and then they often get pregnant on their first IVF, right? Because their bodies are already primed.
Right.
And boom, they get pregnant because we've been treating them and we've been preparing them.
Well, thank you so much, Benita, for your time. We really appreciate it. And, we hope that you all found this interview useful. Thank you for watching, and we wish you all well. Thank you.
Thank you.